Don't be shy, Jake. Just play the notes I taught you. Just be gentle, I whisper, leaning into the warmth radiating from the man beside me at the piano. For months, this bench has been my sanctuary. I lost my sight, but I found his soul. Every afternoon, the air fills with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, a fragrance that makes me feel safe. Every touch is a promise. But lately, when the sun goes down, that promise feels like a lie. Linda, darling, you're overthinking the melody again. A voice says, sharp, metallic, smelling of expensive cigars and cold gin. Jake, what are you doing? You were just. I reach out, my hand brushing a sleeve of cold, stiff Italian silk, not the soft cotton from 10 minutes ago. Stop fussing. You're embarrassing us in front of the lawyer, the voice snaps. When he says my name like that, I feel a chill that has nothing to do with the draft in the room. This isn't the man who just hummed along to my sonata. This is a stranger wearing my fiancé's skin. Is the paperwork ready, Mr. Sterling? The cold version of Jake asks, his hand gripping my shoulder with a possessiveness that feels like a cage. My father was very clear in his trust. I don't inherit the Sterling Transit legacy unless I am married by the end of the quarter. And Linda, my beautiful, fragile Linda, is the key to everything. My fiancé doesn't care about my music or even my recovery. All he cares about is the timeline and the vaults. He needs a wife to unlock his father's billions, and he's using a shadow to keep me happy until the papers are signed. I'm just a signature on a page, but the man who smells like rain and wood smoke is the one I've already given my heart to. Before we get into the main story, let me know in the comment section where you are watching from. Subscribe and share because I have more interesting stories to share with you. The afternoon sun warmed the mahogany of the grand piano, but for Linda, the world was composed entirely of vibrations and scents. Her fingers moved with a practiced grace across the keys, translating her darkness into a soft, melodic sonata. She felt the familiar shift in the air as the door opened, and a presence settled onto the bench beside her. This was the moment she lived for, the arrival of Jake, the man who had promised to be her eyes. She leaned toward him, expecting the sharp, metallic tang of his expensive cigars or the sterile scent of the office. Instead, she was met with something entirely different. A soft, earthy fragrance of crushed jasmine and damp soil clung to him, mingling with the scent of wood smoke from a distant fireplace. It was a rustic, grounding aroma that made her chest tighten in a way the real Jake never did. "You're early today," she whispered, her hands stalling on the ivory keys. He didn't answer with the usual brisk update on his architecture firm or a complaint about the traffic. Instead, he simply sighed, a deep, soulful sound, and placed his hand over hers. His palm was warm, the skin calloused and rough in a way that felt honest and real. It wasn't the manicured hand of a high-society mogul. As he began to hum the low harmony to her melody, the vibration of his voice felt different against her skin, resonating with a gentleness that was usually absent in the man she was supposed to marry. For an hour, they existed in a bubble of shared silence and music. He guided her fingers through a difficult transition with a patience that felt like a gift. To Linda, this was the Jake who understood the language of her soul. Yet, a nagging doubt flickered in the back of her mind. This man felt like the earth, while her fiancé felt like the glass skyscrapers he designed. As the lesson ended, the front door slammed in the distance, followed by the heavy, arrogant click of designer loafers on the marble floor. Linda froze. The man beside her tensed, his hand slipping away from hers as if he had been burned. "Linda, why is the house so dark?" the voice from the hallway snapped. It was Jake's voice, identical in pitch, but lacking the music she had just heard. The man on the bench stood up quickly, the scent of jasmine trailing behind him as he retreated toward the back servant's entrance. Linda sat paralyzed, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't need eyes to realize that the man who just entered the room wasn't the man who had been sitting beside her. The scent of jasmine was fading, replaced by the suffocating smell of cold gin and arrogance as her real fiancé approached. In the silence of her blindness, she had just discovered the first crack in the perfect life she thought she had. The heavy, clinical scent of expensive cigars and cold gin announced Jake's presence long before he reached the piano. The lingering, earthy warmth of jasmine and wood smoke had evaporated, replaced by a chilling air of boardroom authority that made Linda's fingers stiffen against the keys. She felt the sharp, sudden weight of his hand on her shoulder. Not the calloused, gentle touch of the man who had sat beside her moments ago, but a grip that was cold, possessive, and practiced. "There she is," Jake's voice boomed, projecting toward the hallway where his security detail lingered. "My beautiful, silent muse." He didn't ask about her music or notice the lingering resonance of the harmony she had just shared with his shadow. Instead, he reached for her left hand, sliding a massive emerald-cut diamond onto her finger. The platinum felt like an ice cube against her skin, a heavy shackle that lacked the soul of the humming melody still echoing in her mind. To Jake, this wasn't a symbol of love. It was a deposit on the sterling legacy he was desperate to claim. "The gala starts in an hour, Linda. With a sapphire gown, the one that makes you look helpless and elegant," he commanded, his voice devoid of the tenderness she had craved. "Kian will be there, and we need the board to see exactly how much you rely on my protection." As he pulled her toward the stairs, Linda stumbled, her cane forgotten in the corner. Usually, the afternoon Jake would have caught her waist with a steady, grounding strength, whispering an apology that smelled of rain. But this man merely tightened his grip on her arm, his pace brisk and impatient. He spoke of her trust fund and the inconvenience of her upcoming surgery as if she were a piece of architecture rather than a woman. Every word out of his mouth was a sharp contrast to the quiet gardener who had guided her fingers over the difficult transitions of her sonata. The stand-in had treated her as a partner in music, but the man holding the ring treated her as a trophy to be polished and displayed. As the cold metal of the diamond bit into her skin, Linda felt a hollow ache in her chest. She realized she was grieving for a man she was never supposed to know, while the man she was promised to felt more like a stranger with every passing second. The heavy, stifling atmosphere of the main house, thick with the scent of Jake's expensive cigars, drove Linda toward the French doors. She needed air that hadn't been bought and sold. With her cane tapping a rhythmic pulse against the stone tiles, she navigated the terrace, intending to find the familiar bench by the fountain. But a stray breeze, carrying a sudden, intoxicating rush of jasmine and wet earth, pulled her off the beaten path. Her heart skipped. It was the scent of the man from the piano bench. She followed the fragrance, her cane sinking into soft, untended grass. The manicured geometry of the estate gave way to wilder, overgrown brush. She felt the temperature drop as she stepped under a dense canopy of trees. This was the dead zone, a part of the garden Jake had forbidden her to visit, claiming the uneven ground was too dangerous for a woman in her condition. To Linda, however, it felt like the only place that was truly alive. The tap of her cane hit a wooden border, and she stopped. The air here was vibrating with the hum of bees and the rustle of shears against thick vines. "You shouldn't be here, Miss Linda," a voice said. It was low and steady, vibrating through the soles of her feet before it reached her ears. Linda froze. I was looking for the jasmine." "Who is that?" "One of the new gardeners." "Just a hired hand," the man replied, but the lie felt thin. She heard him set down his tools and approach. As he drew closer, the scent intensified, jasmine, wood smoke, and a deep, comforting warmth. He didn't grab her arm with the cold authority she had come to expect from Jake. Instead, he gently touched the tip of her cane, guiding her away from a protruding root. "The ground is treacherous here," he whispered. The moment he spoke those words, Linda's breath hitched. It was the same voice that had hummed the low harmony to her sonata, the same tone that had sat in soulful silence beside her piano. But there was a raw, aching vulnerability in it now that she had never heard when he was pretending to be her fiancé. His hand briefly brushed against hers as he steadied her, and the calluses were unmistakable, honest, hard-working, and kind. "You aren't just a gardener," Linda said, her voice trembling as she reached out into the void, her fingers grazing the rough fabric of a simple cotton shirt. "And you weren't just a hired hand yesterday at the piano." The silence that followed was heavy with the truth. She couldn't see his face, but she felt the frantic beat of a heart that mirrored her own. In the forbidden shade of the secret garden, the man who was supposed to be a shadow finally stood in the light of her perception. The sanctuary of the secret garden felt like a distant dream as Linda was led back into the suffocating opulence of the main house. The scent of wood smoke still clung to her hair, a ghostly reminder of Blake, but it was quickly drowned out by the sharp, medicinal tang of the floor polish and the heavy, humid air of Jake's study. She moved silently, her cane hovering just above the thick Persian rugs, until the low, conspiratorial murmur of voices stopped her in her tracks near the library doors. "The girl is getting suspicious, Jake," a voice hissed. It was Kian, Jake's business associate, his tone as oily and abrasive as a rusted hinge. "She's asking questions about the timeline. If she realizes you've been using her shadow to keep her docile, the whole thing collapses." Linda pressed herself against the cold marble of the hallway, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't need sight to feel the predator in the room. "She doesn't realize anything," Jake's voice replied, dripping with a cold, calculated arrogance that made Linda's skin crawl. "She's too busy playing her little songs and dreaming of the day she can see again. She's the perfect mark. The surgery is scheduled for next Tuesday, and while her eyes are bandaged and her mind is clouded with sedatives, the transfer will be finalized." "And the medical trust?" Kian asked, the sound of a clinking glass suggesting a celebratory drink. "Empty," Jake said, a dark chuckle vibrating through the door. "By the time the bandages come off and she realizes she still can't see because we used a back-alley surgeon to save costs, the inheritance will be in a shell company in the Caymans. My gambling debts will be gone, and Linda will be just another tragic headline. A blind heiress who lost everything in a failed attempt to buy back the light." The world seemed to tilt beneath Linda's feet. The surgery wasn't a miracle, it was a distraction. Her family's legacy, the very fund meant to protect her future, was being bled dry to pay for Jake's sins. The man she was supposed to marry wasn't just a liar. He was a thief who intended to leave her in permanent darkness, both physically and financially. She turned away, her hands trembling so violently she had to grip her cane to keep from dropping it. She realized now that she wasn't just a trophy to Jake. She was a vault he intended to crack open and discard. But as she retreated into the shadows of the hallway, the memory of Blake's calloused hands and the scent of jasmine gave her a flicker of something Jake had never factored into his calculations: a reason to fight back. The air in the recovery suite was heavy with the scent of antiseptic and the faint, lingering trail of Jake's expensive cigars. But beneath it all, Linda's heightened senses searched for something else. Her eyes were wrapped in thick, oppressive layers of gauze, a physical weight that mirrored the darkness she had lived in for years. Jake had left an hour ago, his parting words a cold reminder of the fortune he had spent on her recovery, a lie that now tasted like ash in her mouth. She lay perfectly still, her breathing shallow and rhythmic, feigning the deep, drug-induced sleep the doctors expected. The heavy oak door creaked open, the sound so minute it would have been lost to anyone else. But Linda heard it. She heard the soft, hesitant scuff of worn leather boots instead of the sharp click of designer loafers. Then, the atmosphere shifted. The clinical coldness of the room was punctured by a familiar warmth, the scent of jasmine and wood smoke that had become her only tether to sanity. It was Blake. He didn't speak. He moved with a quiet reverence, his footsteps ghosting across the floor until he was standing right beside her bed. Linda kept her face neutral, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs that she prayed he couldn't hear. She felt the bed dip slightly as he sat on the edge, and then a hand, warm, calloused, and trembling, lightly brushed a stray lock of hair away from her forehead. "I'm so sorry, Linda," he whispered, his voice a broken thread of the soulful harmony they had shared at the piano. "I never wanted to be part of this. I never wanted to be another shadow in your darkness." He took her hand, his thumb tracing the cold, heavy diamond Jake had forced upon her. To her surprise, he didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned down, and she felt the warmth of his breath against her cheek. "If I could give you my own eyes just so you could see the truth, I would," he murmured, his voice thick with a raw, honest devotion that Jake was incapable of feeling. "You deserve a world that is as beautiful as the music you make, not this cage of lies." Linda felt a single, hot tear escape from beneath the bandages, soaking into the gauze. In the silence of the room, Blake's confession was the only real thing she had ever felt. He wasn't just a stand-in or a hired hand. He was the man who had been loving her in the silence while his brother plotted her ruin. She remained still, a silent witness to his grief, realizing that while her eyes were still bound in darkness, she had never seen more clearly in her life. The The darkness behind the bandages was no longer a void. It was a canvas of sharp, sensory truths. Linda remained perfectly still, her hand resting in Blake's calloused grip, letting the silence stretch until it became heavy with the weight of the things unsaid. The scent of jasmine and wood smoke was so thick now it felt like a physical presence, a stark contrast to the sterile, cold atmosphere of the room. Blake's thumb continued to trace the edge of the diamond ring, a gesture of mournful longing that shattered the last of her doubts. "Why did you come back, Blake?" she whispered, her voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. The hand holding hers flinched, the sudden intake of breath beside her sounding like a physical blow. Blake didn't pull away, but the air in the room seemed to freeze. He had been caught in his own moment of vulnerability, believing her to be lost in a sedative-induced haze. "Linda," he stammered, his voice losing the arrogant edge he used when playing his brother's part. You should be resting. The medication. The medication hasn't dulled my ears," she interrupted, turning her bandaged head toward the sound of his voice. "I know it's you. I've known for a long time. Jake doesn't hum in minor keys, and he certainly doesn't smell of earth and honesty. Tell me the truth, Blake. Why are there two of you?" A long, shuddering sigh escaped him, and the bed groaned as he leaned his head into his free hand. The facade finally crumbled. "Because Jake is a coward," he confessed, his voice a raw, jagged rasp. "He found your company tedious once the novelty of the inheritance wore off. He forced me to take his place whenever he had a debt to settle or a board member to impress. He knew you couldn't see the difference, and he used my likeness to keep you happy while he bled your trust fund dry. And you let him?" Linda's voice trembled with a mixture of betrayal and a strange, aching pity. "He has the deeds to our mother's medical care, Linda. He's been blackmailing me for years. If I don't play the shadow, she loses everything," he admitted, his grip on her hand tightening in desperation. "I thought I could just be the ghost in your life, but then I started to care. I fell for the woman at the piano, and every time I had to hand you back to him, it felt like losing my own soul." Linda felt the hot sting of tears against the gauze. The man she loved was a prisoner of the same man who intended to leave her in permanent darkness. The air in the grand dining hall was thick with the suffocating scent of expensive lilies and the sharp, metallic edge of chilled champagne. Linda sat at the head of the table, her eyes still swathed in the heavy gauze that felt less like a medical necessity and more like a blindfold imposed by a captor. This was the final night of the deception, the crescendo of Jake's elaborate heist. Beside her, the man who held her hand didn't smell of cigars or cold ambition. He smelled of the jasmine that had become her secret compass. Jake stood by the sideboard, his voice a low, jagged whisper intended only for his brother's ears. "Don't ruin this, Blake. One more hour of being the devoted fiancé, and the sterling legacy is ours. Remember what happens to mother's care if you slip up." Blake's grip on Linda's hand tightened, a silent, trembling apology that vibrated through her skin. He leaned in, his voice a perfect mimicry of Jake's arrogant baritone for the benefit of Kian and the waiting board members, but his words were meant for her. "You look radiant tonight, Linda. The board is eager to see the woman who will soon lead the Sterling Transit Trust by my side." Across the table, Kian's laughter was a dry, grating sound. "A toast to vision," he declared, the clink of crystal against crystal sounding like the closing of a vault door. "To the day the bandages come off, and we finally see the fruits of our labor." Linda felt the bile rise in her throat. She knew the fruits were her own hollowed-out trust funds. She played her part with the poise of a seasoned performer, tilting her head and offering the rehearsed smiles of a grateful patient. But beneath the table, her free hand was hidden in the folds of her silk dress, her fingers tracing the braille notes she had secretly made of the conversations she'd overheard. Every time Blake squeezed her hand, she felt the agonizing friction of his dual life. He was forced to play the villain to protect their mother, even as he looked at Linda with a devotion that transcended the darkness. The dinner was a masquerade of the highest stakes. Jake believed he was the puppet master, but Linda realized that the silence of her blindness had given her a perspective he would never understand. As the clock chimed midnight, signaling the final hours of her sensory prison, she made a silent vow. Tomorrow, when the light returned, she wouldn't just be seeing the world. She would be tearing down the theater of lies Jake had built, one mask at a time. The morning light filtered through the heavy velvet curtains of the Sterling estate, casting long, golden bars across the recovery room. Linda sat perfectly still as the surgeon's hands worked with methodical precision, the rhythmic snip of scissors against gauze sounding like the ticking of a countdown clock. Behind her, she could feel the presence of the two men, the two heartbeats that had defined her world in the dark. One was erratic and fueled by a restless, greedy energy. The other was steady, heavy with a grief that vibrated through the floorboards. "Slowly now, Linda," the doctor murmured. "Your brain needs time to adjust to the input." As the final layer of gauze fell away, the world exploded into a terrifying, beautiful chaos of colors and shapes. It was an assault of sensory data. The harsh white of the linens, the deep mahogany of the walls, and finally, the two figures standing at the foot of her bed. They were identical in every physical detail. The same sharp jawline, the same raven hair, and the same piercing eyes. Jake stood on the left, dressed in a sharp, slate-gray suit, a confident smirk playing on his lips as he prepared to claim his prize. Blake stood on the right, wearing the simple, dark gardener's clothes she had felt in the secret garden, his expression a mask of tortured resignation. "Welcome back to the light, darling," Jake said, stepping forward with his hand outstretched. "Now that you can finally see who has been by your side all this time, let's sign those final trust documents and start our life." Linda didn't look at the hand. She didn't look at the expensive suit or the gleaming diamond on her own finger. Instead, she looked into their eyes. Jake's were cold, reflecting only the shimmer of the legal papers in his hand. But when she turned to the man on the right, she saw the depths of the jasmine-scented soul she had fallen for. She saw the raw vulnerability, the hidden scars of a man who had been forced into the shadows, and the unmistakable warmth that had guided her fingers over the piano keys. "I can see everything now, Jake," Linda said, her voice ringing with a newfound clarity that silenced the room. "I see the thief who wants to bleed me dry, and I see the man who actually loved me when I had nothing to give but my music." She stood up, her legs shaky but her resolve ironclad. To the shock of the assembled lawyers and the fury of her fiancé, she walked past the man in the suit and reached for the calloused hand of the gardener. "I'm choosing the man who smells of rain," she whispered. In the brilliance of the morning, the masquerade was finally over, and for the first time in her life, Linda wasn't just observing the light. She was the one wielding it. The Sterling estate, once a place of suffocating secrets, felt hollow as the police led Jake and Kian away in handcuffs. Their downfall had been swift, fueled by the ledger of financial discrepancies Linda had tracked through sound and touch, and finally confirmed with her own eyes. The silence that followed their departure wasn't the heavy, fearful quiet of the past. It was the peaceful stillness of a house finally cleared of its ghosts. Linda stood in the center of the grand foyer, the morning sun streaming through the windows and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, details she had only ever imagined. Beside her, Blake remained hesitant, his hands shoved deep into his pockets as if he still expected to be ordered back into the shadows. He looked at her with an intensity that made her heart race, a mix of awe and the lingering fear that his role in the lie had cost him the right to stay. "The lawyers say the trust fund can be recovered," Linda said, her voice steady and clear. "Jake's gambling debts will be his own to settle in a cell. And your mother's care, it's already been moved to a private facility under my name. No more blackmail, Blake. No more masks." Blake took a step toward her, the scent of jasmine and wood smoke, his true scent, enveloping her once more. "I don't know how to be a man people see, Linda. I've spent my whole life being the version of him that was convenient." "Then we'll learn together," she replied, reaching up to brush a lock of hair from his forehead, her fingers finding the familiar warmth she had known in the dark. "You were the only one who truly saw me when I couldn't see myself. The music we made wasn't a lie." They walked out of the house and toward the secret garden, leaving the cold marble and the memories of the wrong twin behind. Linda sat at the stone bench where she had first discovered the truth, closing her eyes for a moment to simply listen. The world was loud, bright, and complicated, but as Blake sat beside her and hummed the melody of their piano sonata, she knew she wasn't lost. For the first time, her vision and her heart were perfectly aligned. The darkness was gone, and in its place was a life built on a truth that didn't need eyes to be seen. Thank you for watching and listening to this story. Hit the subscribe button as I will be bringing more interesting stories. Turn on your notification because you would not want to miss my story for anything.